Okay, the next item of business is the debate on motion 19436 in the name of Martin Whitfield on a Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee debate, strengthening committee's effectiveness. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. I can advise the Chamber we've got a bit of time in hand this afternoon, so I will be generous with the speaking allocations and you will certainly get the time back for any interventions. I call on Martin Whitfield on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee to speak to and move the motion a generous 9 minutes. Mr Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it's nice to stand in this Parliament with a little time to debate. I'm sure we'll have lost that by the end of the year. The late Donald Dewar, in response to critics aimed at the Scottish Parliament, once said, "Cynicism, together with unrealistic expectation, are the two great bugbears of politics." Well, we've tackled these two great bugbears head-on in our inquiry and report on strengthening committees' effectiveness. The cynicism is to think that there is nothing that can be done to address the perception that committees are not fulfilling their potential. The unrealistic expectation is that whilst there is merit in committee members leaving their party roles at the committee door, it's not always appropriate, desirable or even realistic for members to put their party role entirely to one side. I would like to thank all of those who have engaged with our inquiry and the collective will shown by all to improve the effectiveness of how committees operate. From our witnesses, from colleagues across this chamber and beyond, from institutions that lodge submissions and contributions, I say thank you. I would also, however, like to specifically extend my thanks to Dr Danielle Bezic, who was appointed as an advisor to assist the committee with its inquiry into effectiveness, a role she undertook with passion, intellect and an expectation she placed on the committee to rise to be our very best. What we as the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee bring to the Parliament is a package of comprehensive, practical, deliverable set of recommendations to reform and renew the work of committees. And in opening this debate, I wish to set out the main conclusions and recommendations reached by the committee, and I move the motion in my name. Turning first to the issue of culture, we heard that if a committee has strong culture, it works effectively. Committee members play a pivotal role in setting that culture. I ask all members of committees to recognise the magnitude of our responsibilities. How we behave, how we approach, how we see our role is fundamental not only into what committees do and how they do it, but potentially to how it is viewed by the public and what it can achieve. Our recommendations aim to bring a sense of cohesion, a collective endeavour to a committee. These include a recommendation that committees set objectives for individual pieces of scrutiny and inquiry work and seek to assess their effectiveness in their annual reports. We recognise the importance of an induction programme and ongoing training for members. The needs to be tallied with the support from clerks, from SPICE, which is well resourced, and also ensuring external expertise is utilised, whether via committee advisers, SPICE, fellowships, academic and sector experts. We've also recommended that informal fact-finding sessions and away days be seen as important components in members getting to know each other beyond the other political realm, and that will foster a sense of collective working. Turning secondly to the issue of whether size does matter in relation to the number of members on a committee, well, we believe it does. We have recommended a reduction in the maximum number of members for subject and mandatory committees from 15 to 10. We believe that committees should normally have a maximum of 7 members. We believe this change will help address concerns that larger committees are exacerbating the issue of members serving on more than one committee, the high churn of membership on committees, and we consider our proposals still leave flexibility to ensure that smaller parties can be represented on committees and committee places are still allocated broadly in line with the balance of political parties in this Parliament. More than happy to.
Paul Sweeney.
For giving way. Does he also recognise that by sheer dint of numbers, a Parliament of 129 members, of which a large minority are government ministers makes it very difficult in terms of a workload perspective for large committees to function.
Martin Whitfield.
I thank the member for that intervention, and it was, in some of our evidence, suggested as being one of the consequences of the results of large committees. As to the role and whether the accountability of government ministers, quote, the payroll, should form part of the discussion, I think that's for, well, it'd be an interesting discussion this afternoon in this chamber and beyond moving forward. If I can turn now to the gender balance on committees and how this might be supported and indeed achieved. This inquiry has afforded us the opportunity to explore in more detail the suite of recommendations in the gender-sensitive audit regarding committee membership. We recognise and support the importance of having a gender-sensitive Parliament. We will propose changes to standing orders so that next session there are no single-sex committees. And on the question of whether to go further, there is a balance that has to be struck between the proposals, which are aspirational and ambitious, but also have to be practically deliverable. We do not consider it is fair to place a disproportionate burden of work on women if proportionality in parties and across this Parliament is not in place. We have therefore recommended that when committees are established, the Bureau should ensure membership normally reflects the gender balance of the whole Parliament, and where this is not achieved or achievable, the Bureau must make a statement explaining why, at the point of moving the relevant motion, that has occurred. I'll give way to my Deputy Convener, and then I'll come to you, Mr Mason.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Martin Whitfield for giving way. I should say I rise at the moment not as the Deputy Convener but as an individual MSP. In giving that statement where gender balance has not been possible, Martin Whitfield, like myself, will have received a letter from the group this morning which suggests that the statement should be made in chamber. Does he agree with me that that brings a level of accountability and scrutiny to whether we're achieving those aspirations of gender equality in our committees?
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful for Ruth Maguire's intervention. Let me say I think accountability is very important, and I think on my first readings of the letter, any sense to show that accountability, to bring it to the public notice, will be a very, very important part in moving in the next session towards all of the crucially important underpinning that the gender-sensitive audit has shown needs to happen. Mr Mason, I'm happy to say.
John Mason.
I thank Mr Whitfield for giving way. On the point of committees reflecting, would you accept that there's a particular problem if the governing party, as has happened under the SNP, creates government ministers who are equally balanced between male and female, and that puts actually extra pressure on the remaining members of that party, which becomes therefore effectively more male?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that intervention. And of course, you're right, John Mason, because the challenge with committees is that they come at a stage where we are already aware of the gender balance that sits within the Parliament. We're aware of the gender balance that sits within political parties. And, you know, the very laudable and correct aim for the government to have gender balance in its ministerial portfolios places the pressure then on the remaining in chamber. And we heard a substantial amount of evidence of the challenge that has placed on workloads that go on individuals, female individuals in this case, for the Parliament. So I agree, it is one of the tensions that exist about where upstream does this have to be put right, so that what comes out in the committees by way of gender balance can most easily be achieved. So I thank you for that. I wish to turn to consider the key role of the convener, the person who sits at the helm of the committee and plays in a committee's effectiveness a crucial role. We heard that a good convener creates a culture of interest, curiosity, collaboration. To enhance their role, we recommend that a programme of support for conveners is put in place from the start of Session 7, which can be coordinated by the Conveners Group. On the question of elected conveners, we learned that it operates effectively in other legislatures. Also, that being elected by the whole chamber can bring confidence and visibility to the role. It also gives a sense of legitimacy and accountability for a convener for the activities of their committee. And it can also assist in the perception by the public that the committees operate independently from government and have a distinct identity. We are aware I will give way again.
John Mason.
My apologies for giving way again, but I did want to raise this with him. Does he think there's a need for conveners to be trained? Because I think chairing any meeting, including this one, but committees, not everybody is naturally good at chairing a meeting, and it does take certain skills.
Thank you. I think Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. The skill set that MSPs suddenly realise they need when they come into this place is extensive. And there is certainly a need for support. Training is a word that can be used to apply that to conveners and other members of committees and indeed MSPs across, to allow them to facilitate in an environment that many of them will have had no experience in. So I agree wholeheartedly that the training and support needs to be there. What that looks like, I think, has to be tailored to the individual who's seeking that support. I will
Jackson Carlo.
I hear all this about training, but I have a reservation, and that is that we end up producing little identikit people. And that's my worry. Who trains the trainers? Who decides what the training should be? I mean, I'm full of horror. I read Ross Greer in here going on about all of this. I don't want to be trained by Ross Greer in what he thinks my responsibilities as a convener of a committee should be. So who is responsible for that? I don't want a whole lot of identikit conveners. I do want a range of personality and function. Yes, they have to understand some basic things, but let's not start straitjacketing what the job is by the definition of somebody that I might not agree with.
Martin Whitfield.
And for the member to be the judge of that, I would also be afeard of. But you are right, and that at no stage is any of this orientated to create an identikit committee in an identikit parliament that just does identikit things. I think, to go back to my answer to John Mason, if MSPs coming to this place do bring a skill, they bring a skill of understanding and knowing themselves. And I think they need to rely on that strength, as they will have done throughout campaigns, as they will have done throughout their political careers, however long or short. And they should have confidence to say, no, that is not for me, but I do need this. I think an opening and two-way discussion about where someone can be supported does not necessitate an identikit product. Far from it. I will do.
Very briefly, Jackson Carlo.
The problem I have with that is it's not the experience of the Parliament. In my experience, what happens is the people who suggest that initially, it's as it should be. But as time goes on, it becomes embedded as a practice you must follow. And I can think of other examples in parliamentary life of where that's happened. Discretion has gone out the window.
And I would give you one more minute and 40 seconds, Mr Whitfield. Thank you.
Let me, in the politest term, suggest that discussion is crucially important, but perhaps is maybe for this venue at a different time, because I think it speaks to real challenges this Parliament has. We are aware of concerns about elected conveners, how that would operate in practice, and whether the size of the Parliament and potential small size of parties would mean that whips would still control who stands for nomination, and some who felt that parties should be able to decide who their own representatives are as conveners. As a committee, we believe the time is right to allow an opportunity for the whole Parliament to consider whether there should be elected conveners in the next parliamentary session. Our report sets out a model procedure which broadly mirrors that used in the Senate. We consider the model represents a proportionate approach to the use in particular of chamber time to solve the problem of election. And we are keen to gauge the views of other members on this proposal before making our formal recommendations for standing order rule changes. It's also important to add that with regards to convenerships and remuneration, we do not consider conveners need to receive an additional payment in order to enhance their status, as I've previously set out. I am very conscious of time. I would have liked to have talked about, ironically, the capacity and workload of committees, and indeed the capacity and workload that sits within this chamber. But in particular, finally, Presiding Officer, I want to turn to the role of committee stakeholders and the role the public can play in helping ensure committees deliver effective scrutiny. The Parliament has always valued the relationship with the public and recognised its importance. And indeed, I recommend the Citizens' Participation and Petitions Committee's proposals over deliberative democracy, and specifically the use of people's panels, to be embedded in the work of committees. I look forward to listening to the reflections and views of other members across this chamber, and can I extend my apologies for having used up all of the vacant time that we had from earlier on. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Minister Graham Day to open on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Earlier this year, the Parliament celebrated its 25th anniversary, a symbolic milestone and a prompt for reflection on how the institution has evolved over the past 25 years. Our procedures and ways of working have adapted over time as we've learned about what works well and what doesn't. But this process of adaptation, as we learn from experience, should never be considered complete, and that's why the committee's report is so welcome. Ensuring the Parliament is operating effectively is essential for ensuring the people of Scotland are well represented by those they have chosen to act on their behalf. Given the importance of protecting the constitutional principle of ministers being accountable to the Parliament, I hope members will understand the need for me to ensure that I avoid giving any impression that the Government is directing the Parliament about how it discharges its responsibilities. It's always up to this Parliament to decide how best it operates. Presiding Officer, my principal interest today is in considering how any changes being deliberated might impact on the delivery of government business. That's reflected in the Scottish Government's response to the committee's report, in which we acknowledge that many matters within the report are not for the Scottish Government to offer a view on. There are, though, a few aspects in which we have shared views and are indeed supportive of the committee's proposals. I hope everyone in the Chamber would agree with the following two principles. Firstly, that the Government must have the freedom to be able to bring forward the proposals it considers necessary to give effect to its democratic mandate. Secondly, that the Parliament must have the freedom to scrutinise those proposals and hold the Government to account effectively. It's in that context we have to consider the concerns that have been raised about the Parliament's workload. I can assure members that the Government does take parliamentary capacity into account as it takes forward its legislative plans. It's no accident that the volume of legislation in this session is comparable to the volumes of previous sessions, and I do not think it's tenable to suggest that the Government should scale back its ambitions. The question for Parliament and committees instead is how best to balance efficiency and effectiveness in its scrutiny of government activity. And it's also for Parliament to ensure that there is an adequate support for MSPs to conduct their duties as legislators. I would hope that we can all agree. Indeed.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention on that point. And indeed, we have discussed on a number of times the balance that there are a few more bills, government bills, than in the last session, but we still have this pressure of time. Would you recognise, though, that when we have a situation where there are over 500 government amendments lodged at stage 2, the committee will need substantially more time to deal with those than they would do if the thinking and thought had gone in beforehand and it came into the committee with those amendments already in?
Minister.
I would accept that criticism to a large degree, but I think the convener would also perhaps accept the point that we've got into a situation in this Parliament where a great many amendments that have been debated at stage 2 then come back at stage 3, and we've extended stage 3 proceedings as well, which again has a pressure on parliamentary time. So I absolutely accept that there is something to be looked at there. I would also, Presiding Officer, hope we can all agree that it's neither efficient nor effective for Parliament to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Where something is significant or controversial or of particular interest to committees, then of course committees should spend more of their time on these issues. But when something is technical or minor, then I hope it would not be controversial to suggest that the committee could take a different approach. As our response to the committee noted, the Government is supportive of the earlier deadline proposed for the introduction of members' bills to ensure there is sufficient time available for them to be considered in full. The ability to bring forward legislation is a core function of the Parliament, and it's important that MSPs have the ability to do so. But the ability to bring forward legislation is only meaningful if there is time available to scrutinise it. Bringing forward the introduction deadline for members' bills should help to ensure that the time will be available. I note that this year there were 11 bills introduced within 6 months of the June 2nd deadline. 5 of those were in the final month. That's 26% of the total across the session being introduced in the final available month. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government notes the committee's recommendation in relation to better use of time-limited committees. Of course, such committees are already possible within the Parliament's current structures, though I would note they are rarely used. While the Government is supportive of such committees being used more often, clear timescales, remit payments and expected outputs are key to ensuring such committees are fit for purpose. Presiding Officer, although I am primarily speaking on behalf of the Scottish Government this afternoon, my 15 years as an MSP is shortly coming to an end, and I do want to share some of my own thoughts on the matter of committee effectiveness while I still have the opportunity to do so. In that vein, Presiding Officer, let me reflect on the proposal to reduce committee sizes. That is something I bear the scars of having attempted that previously. The Government would contend that committee sizes, like the Parliament itself, should reflect the democratic choices of the Scottish people, and therefore there should be no move away from the D'Hondt system for committee formation. However, there is no doubt that for conveners, large committees can be unwieldy. They are not conducive to optimising the outputs of the committee. From my previous time as Minister for Parliamentary Business, though, I have been there and bought the T-shirt when it comes to seeking to make committees less unwieldy. Let me recognise that at the time there was a real willingness to at least consider this, and that in Maurice Golden, the then Conservative business manager, I had an ally. Between us and with the support of our parties, we were able to address this to an extent, at least on a one-for-one basis between the Conservatives ourselves. I think all told in the end we reduced the size of 3 committees. But owing to the unwillingness, the understandable unwillingness, to be fair, of smaller parties who did not wish to surrender their single representation in some committees, that is as far as we got. I heard the convener indicate that the Standards Committee may have a cunning plan for cracking that at this time. I wish them well, because reducing the maximum size of committees was a good idea back in the day, and it remains a good idea still. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, on behalf of the Scottish Government, I welcome the committee's consideration. Do I have time, Presiding Officer?
Yes.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's giving us his reflections. One of the themes of this report, and many other reports that have been commissioned and have been produced over time, is the effect of party management on committees. We didn't really get into that in the convener's speech. What is the Minister's experience telling him we would need to do to change the culture in the committees so that there's less party dominance and more evidence-led parliamentarian activity?
Minister.
I'm actually going to try and cover that in my closing speech if Stephen Kerr bears with me. But I would just say in passing, I hope that the point he's making is not simply directed at the Government, but is reflective of the whole Parliament. And I see him nodding his head, indicating that. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, on behalf of the Government, I welcome the Committee's consideration of how the Parliament's processes can be adjusted to improve effectiveness. And I look forward to hearing the views from across the Chamber. We, or perhaps more accurately they, those individuals elected to the next Parliament, have a chance to come together and deliver more productive and effective ways of working. Presiding Officer, the Government will support today's motion on the basis that it's ultimately up to the Parliament to decide how it structures and organises itself. I note the motion asks Parliament to agree to consider a proposed rule change for the election of committee conveners. I want to be clear that the Government has no formal position on the election of committee conveners, but it recognises that Parliament should be able to consider this matter further if there is a desire on the part of members to do so. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Jackson Carnott to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's a pleasure to participate in the debate this afternoon. I see Richard Leonard's leading for the Labour Party. It's a kind of dinosaurs are us outing of the ancien regime of happy times past. And I have to say, over the time I've been in the Parliament, I've come to like it. I've come to admire it at its very best. Like others, I imagine, to despair of it at times. Not to believe that anything can ever be perfect, that every institution has its imperfections, but to believe that potentially there are ways in which things can change. But there are obstacles in the way of every change. Sometimes it's a vested interest, sometimes it's a protocol or a practice, sometimes, as I said earlier, it is that the architects of a particular guideline move on, and that guideline becomes a rule which people are then obliged to follow, and it becomes a straitjacket rather than something itself which can be amended. So I'm not going to repeat really the bulk of the submission that we as a party made, because it was a serious enterprise that we went into to do so, but to touch on a number of themes. I'm supposed to be leading from the party. I might stray from that strict responsibility a little bit from time to time. But I know the first thing I wanted to talk about was continuity. To commend the report, by the way, but to talk about continuity and size. Because I notice this committee itself, a committee of 5, a little bit like my Citizens' Participation and Public Petitions Committee, which is a committee of 5. And on page 1, it highlights one of the big difficulties Evelyn Tweed left the committee on the 6th of March and was replaced by Jackie Dunbar. Stephen Kerr left the committee on the 28th of March 2024 and was replaced by Oliver Mundell. Ivan McKee left the committee on the 6th of May 2024 was replaced by Ruth Maguire. Jackie Dunbar then left the committee and was replaced by Joe Fitzpatrick. Oliver Mundell then left, who'd replaced Stephen Kerr, and was replaced by Sue Webber. And Joe Fitzpatrick left the committee and then was replaced by Emma Roddick. In practice, if I'm right, only 2 of the people who initiated this inquiry were actually here at the end of it when they published the report. And that was exactly the same experience I had on the Citizens Participation Committee when we were looking at the whole issue of public participation. And where is the continuity in the narrative that emerges at the end of that if those who have actually been a party to the investigation that's taken place have all gone? And so that the only 2 people left in my committee, David Torrance and I, had to really sort of overcome the wave of indifference from colleagues who joined later, who had nothing to do with the investigation about which we were about to make a sort of terribly important report. And I think that lack of continuity is a fundamental thing. So if I switch to something we didn't, or will look, Mr. Sweeney? Oh, who was one of those who left me?
Paul Sweeney?
As someone who was bereft to miss the overseas visits as part of the committee's work, I do regret that change in committee role. But it makes an important point, not just about the practicality of institutional memory, but also the culture of the committee being something that you have a loyalty to and that actually you have a sense of purpose in serving on. If that is upended at any moment, then surely that means the committees are fundamentally undermined in a cultural sense.
Jackson Carter?
Why is it always former colleagues from Westminster who are fond of overseas trips? But notwithstanding that, that casual observation. So what are the obstacles to continuity? Well, the first Parliament had about 18 ministers in the government. This one has got, it's now up to about 25. So we actually take out about 7 additional people who might be available to participate in the committees. So I think we have a lot of committees, large memberships, and then potentially too many people competing on them. To return to the point I was about to make about the convenerships, well, we were a bit lukewarm about that. I can see, and it's interesting, we'll support the motion tonight because it's going to investigate the possibility of how all that might be and how they might be remunerated. The one argument for remuneration, I think, might be if that meant that the committee convener committed to convening the committee for the entire length of the Parliament and set aside any other ambition, therefore did not see the convenership of the committee as a stepping stone to anything else, but was totally focused on that and then independently able to do that and to have the effort that they had made recognised. Ruth Maguire?
Ruth Maguire?
Sorry.
Grateful to Jackson Carlo for giving way. The points he makes about continuity of committee, does that speak to the importance of the convener? And in terms of, I know, and I wouldn't want to cast aspersions, but there wasn't a lack of enthusiasm from the different members when we were doing this inquiry here. So it kind of talks to the importance of the convener in holding everyone together and delivering that enthusiasm, not casting aspersions that you weren't doing that. I'm just... Yeah.
Jackson Carlo?
I would hope not. but no, I understand the point. I think that is why I think there is an argument for the role of the convener being one that people value as something that they will be adhering to for the duration of a parliament. The issue of gender, I think, is an interesting one because the only female I had on my Citizens Participation and Public Petitions Committee was pinched by Mr Whitfield, who's in here recommending that such committees shouldn't exist. He stepped in and took the female representative we had within our small committee of 5 away and then refused to replace her, such that, that I think that we recognise in the evidence as a committee that we submitted to this report, that meant on some issues it was certainly the case that our overall experience within the committee membership probably did not reflect the kind of questioning that we might have wanted to have of witnesses when interrogating certain petitions. But it's then quite difficult because if a party were elected with a responsibility to represent on various committees and it didn't necessarily have the full gender balance within its own committee, you would be asking the female members of that group to undertake the responsibility of sitting on more committees. And I'm not sure how reasonable that would actually be if they were tied down to having to do that at the expense and other colleagues didn't. But I think the objective is certainly one that we would want to adhere to. Gosh, I've hardly managed to touch on anything, and that's my time almost up. So I do think that the issue of conveners is one that we want to reflect on, and I think it is an important one. In relation to experts and engagement, I welcome the embracing of the citizens' panel here. One of the evidence sessions we had with Brussels was when that Parliament used people's panels to work with parliamentarians. And it was fascinating to hear the exchange of views. They all got down in the room. The parliamentarians looked at the People's panel and said, why should we listen to a thing you say? You're not elected. We've got a democratic mandate. We have the power. We are the people's representatives. And the People's on the People's panel said, yes, but we actually know what we're talking about and you don't. And after they got over that, they actually worked very well together. And so, yes, actually the use of experts and potentially People's panels to help inform committee members on the detail of certain subjects in a way that is productive would, I think, assist the committee members who ultimately must have the responsibility for determining what the outcome will be, to do that with a basis of informed opinion from a wider scope of people. And I think that would be a useful thing to do. Our final recommendation is that post-legislative scrutiny has been the perennial talking point of the Parliament. We think a sunset clause in a number of pieces of legislation would actively force post-legislative scrutiny because the Parliament would be required to consider the issue afresh. So I mentioned these thoughts. As I say, we will support the report tonight. There's a lot of good stuff, a lot of good content in here. And I just hope that wishful thinking is not what this ends up being, but that this can actually help to ameliorate some of the imperfections in a system that we have, which could be better still, and that will require momentum and commitment from all concerned.
Thank you, Mr Carlow. I now call on Richard Leonard to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for producing this thorough and important report into committee effectiveness. We must be clear this afternoon that we are serious about democratic renewal, that we recognise the balance of power between government and Parliament and between Parliament and the people needs a new vitality. Because that's what this debate is about. It's about how Parliament can better hold the executive to account. But we should never lose sight of the role of the people in holding Parliament to account. And by that, I do not mean some kind of elective dictatorship, but I mean a much more participatory style of democracy, a form of government that not only functions for the people, but one that functions through the people. All of us must be vigilant to the rise of a new authoritarianism in the midst of democratic politics. And make no mistake, our civil liberties, our human rights, our constitutional settlement are not sacrosanct or inviolate. We cannot take them for granted. That is what history teaches us, that we have to fight for them. Today I'm invited to contribute as the opening speaker on behalf of the Labour Party, although you must take it as read that I am no longer necessarily and at all times on message. But as I reflect on the committees which I have been privileged to serve on in this Parliament, it remains my firm belief that the Public Audit Committee, amongst those, has been the most effective. But it is a rare spirit of a parliamentary committee, chaired by a member of an opposition party as a matter of rule. It is a mandatory committee in which representatives of the party of government are, by that same rule, in a minority. It is a small committee with just 5 members, and that is not a weakness, that is its strength. Among that small number, we also have experienced a turnover in membership. And let me say for the record that since Sharon Dowie stepped down as Deputy Convener in 2023, and Ros McCall and then Stephanie Callaghan stepped down as substitute members, the Public Audit Committee in all its incarnations for the last couple of years has been all male. Now, don't get me wrong, all of the members have made a valuable contribution, but there is no getting away from the fact that without a broader range of life experience around that committee room table as we scrutinise our major public institutions, their spending, their governance, their leadership, and sometimes even their conduct, that important diversity of perspectives is missing. So it is my firm belief that we must rule, legislate even, for that not happening again on any parliamentary committee. I'm also convinced that accountability to Parliament, not party, or to the patronage of party leaders, through the election by Parliament of committee conveners, would help in the separation of the executive and the legislature. Now, I was struck by Lorna Slater's point in the last debate back in May on this, which is also reproduced in the committee's report, that these convenership elections would need to be about a commitment to rigorous scrutiny, which of course they must. But when Lorna Slater says that we need, I quote her, to avoid popularity contests, I disagree. Popularity is surely what democratic elections are about. It's the same principle we accept when electing Parliament's presiding officer and deputy presiding officers. On other recommendations in the report, there should be greater powers to compel witnesses to attend committees, to give oral and written evidence. And of course, on this question we've already covered, there should be training for committee members. And yes, I will give way.
Stephen Kerr.
Under the Scotland Act, we already have formidable powers to compel witnesses to appear before committees. But I hope before he finishes, he will return to his first theme, which was about why change in this Parliament rarely seems to happen. Because that is the kernel of the issue here. We all agree that things should improve, but why does that improvement not happen?
Richard Leonard.
I will do my level best to answer that question in the time I've got left. But I was addressing the issue of training, and I was bound to say when listening to the earlier part of this debate that every convener should be issued with a copy of Walter Citreen's ABC of Chairmanship, which was something which was widely circulated in the trade union movement. Maybe as well to counter the point that Jackson Carlaw made. I mean, in my case, especially in the early days of being a convener of the Public Audit Committee, I was able to draw on the wisdom of Hugh Henry, who had previously chaired the Public Audit Committee in an earlier session. And his knowledge, his political judgment, is something which I set a great deal of store by and relied on. I'm, however, to be persuaded that there should be remuneration for the role of committee convener, I simply don't accept the argument, which some have deployed, that getting paid extra would boost the profile of committee conveners or increase the significance of their role. We are, in my view, already well paid, and I can't help reflect that when I led the Scottish Labour Party, the honour of doing so was reward in itself, the greatest honour of my life. There was no additional payment. In fact, the only perk in that sense was a guaranteed car parking space. In the end, a healthy democracy rests on the twin pillars of consent and dissent. This debate isn't about, and cannot be about, the efficiency of the bureaucracy. It's got to be about the restoration of trust in politics, in politicians, and in this Parliament. This is no time to be conservative or moderate even. It's time, in my view, to be radical.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. And we now move to the open debate, and I call Sue Webber to be followed by Evelyn Tweed. Ms Webber.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. I thought I was third, but there you go. Presiding Officer, I am pleased to speak in this debate on strengthening the effectiveness of our Parliament's committees. I think I came in right at the beginning of this. I know there was a bit of sugary chairs and stuff, but I can remember hearing most of the evidence. Because this report goes right to the heart of how we serve the people of Scotland. Because the Scottish Parliament's committees are an essential part of the legislative process, and hard-working Scots deserve a Parliament that provides careful examination of evidence and legislation. And when this Parliament was created, the committees were meant to be its engine room. They were meant to be where legislation was tested, where evidence was properly examined, and where the voices of the public could be heard. And these principles are as important now as they were 25 years ago, but I think we can all acknowledge that it's all been stretched thin in recent sessions. Too many bills have been rushed. We're certainly feeling the pain of that now. And too many important details have slipped through the net. And too often, this Parliament has been asked to sign off legislation that was simply not ready. And that's not what good government looks like, and it's not what the people that we represent, frankly, expect from us. Hard-working Scots don't want politics for its own sake. They want us to be competent at what we do, and they want decisions that are thought through, not thrown together to meet a deadline or make a headline. And that means our committees must be able to do their job properly. The report from the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee sets out a number of sensible, practical recommendations that would help us get there. Reducing committee sizes, for example, from 15 down to around 7 members would make a difference. Smaller committees can get into that detail and have some real discussions rather than just managing speaking lists. And having been the convener of a large committee, I understand the pressures that members feel when I've got to cut them short and not allow them to follow that train of thought, which may uncover a nugget or some really important evidence. The report also highlights the problem of the constant churn, and we've heard of that from Mr Carlaw and Mr Leonard, say members being moved on just as they start to understand their brief. But to counter Mr Leonard's comments about the lack of gender equality on his committee right now, with some female members from the Conservatives moving on, some people stayed put and positions were not able to be changed. And so that also contributes as well to that inability to get a woman in the room. And that lack of continuity makes it harder to build expertise and to develop the kind of trust and cross-party working that committees need to function well. So if we want better scrutiny, we need more stability. And I welcome the discussion around the elected conveners, and we've heard from Jackson Carlaw that our written submission certainly stated that it didn't believe that elected conveners alone would improve matters in Parliament unless they were accompanied by wider reforms. But we are welcome the investigation as to how that could move forward. I certainly felt that when I was convener, none of my powers and influence in that role for that period of time I didn't feel any. I was hindered by the fact that I wasn't elected to be there. What we also did in terms of in our written response was we raised some practical concerns about the approach to electing conveners, linking it to the use of the D'Hondt method and questions around how to deal with in-session vacancies. A lot of the churn has carried out, as you see, when members from the government benches find themselves in ministerial roles, and we do find that that contributes significantly to the churn. So letting Parliament choose who leads a committee could really strengthen their independence and improve the accountability. But I agree with the committee's view that that shouldn't come with extra pay. At a time when public finances are stretched, this is my position, I believe that would send the wrong message, because leadership is about responsibility and not necessarily remuneration. But it was a lot of work and it was a lot of effort, more than anyone can realise until you're in that role. And it's also clear that time is one of the biggest barriers to proper scrutiny, and we all feel that pressure, because committees are juggling legislation, inquiries, constituency work, and there's just not enough hours in a week, especially if you sit on a Thursday. Allowing committees to meet while the Chamber is sitting, or using a Monday and Friday mornings for evidence session does make sense, because after all, it's about giving committees the space they need to do the job well. One specific suggestion was made in connection with committee witnesses that I think is important, that came from my party, because we suggested that committee witnesses should have to declare where their financial funding comes from, including the amount of public funding, just to further aid that transparency around the potential influence of the Scottish Government. I think the idea of committees reviewing their own performance each year is a good one, and any other workplace teams look back on what they've achieved and what worked and what didn't work well, and how they might change their approach going forward. So there's no reason, frankly, that Parliament shouldn't do the same, because that's how we keep improving and getting things better. And on the question of gender balance, which I've also alluded to, I support the principle that our committees should reflect the diversity of the Parliament and of Scotland. But we must be careful not to turn it into a tick-box exercise where the women have to take on extra workload just to fill that criteria. And I know that the female parliamentarians that are also on the gender-sensitive audit group have made that point very clear. Because what matters most is that committees are made up of people with the right experience, knowledge and commitment to hold the government to account, and that are interested in that topic as well, because then you get genuine engagement. So let's aim for balance, but keep a focus on merit and effectiveness. This report gives us a clear route to better balance, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Parliament's committees are an essential part of our legislative process, but scrutiny could be improved. So let's make sure that we don't have that poor legislation being rushed through in this session. We really need to get in behind the detail. So with that, let our committees be more effective, our scrutiny be therefore more meaningful, and our Parliament therefore much more accountable to the people that it serves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Webber. Could I take this opportunity to remind all members, including those online, that they do need to press the request to speak button. I call Evelyn Tweed to be followed by David Russell. Ms Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. And I also give thanks to Jackson Carlaw for highlighting my previous role on the committee, one which I actually really enjoyed. Our committees are a vital part of the parliamentary system. The report makes excellent recommendations on how to improve committees' effectiveness, but these are generally focused within a parliamentary session. Some issues, however, require ongoing scrutiny beyond the next election. There are many public bodies and non-ministerial offices in Scotland that are ultimately accountable to Parliament and to our committees. The scrutiny undertaken by those committees is key to ensuring the proper and efficient running of these bodies. However, the current model prevents strategic, long-term oversight. By way of example, it is useful to consider the Scottish Housing Regulator. The regulator is a non-ministerial office directly accountable to the Scottish Parliament for the discharge of its statutory functions. Scrutiny currently takes the form of an annual report compiled by the regulator, followed by one committee meeting where the Chief Executive and the Chair are questioned by members of the relevant committee. Concerns about the regulator have circulated almost since it assumed its full functions in 2012 and have been consistently raised in Parliament. At the Capital and Infrastructure Committee in November 2014, representatives from the housing sector highlighted the regulator's use of informal interventions to pressure housing associations into commissioning consultants it favoured at costs exceeding £1,000 per day, and raised concerns about the heavy-handed and disproportionate use of its powers. Nothing changed. In 2020, following press reports of a culture of fear within the housing sector, members of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee brought these concerns to the regulator during the annual scrutiny session. Again, nothing changed. A decade after the first complaints in 2024, the committee again heard similar allegations regarding bullying and inappropriate intervention by the regulator. This time, other stakeholders from the sector were invited to give evidence, and the concerns were not so easily dismissed. While more headway was made, my concern is that following the election and change in committee membership, this issue will again lose momentum. And in the past decade, at least 16 smaller housing associations have merged with others, largely as a result of regulator intervention. And this does seem disproportionate. It's a disproportionate loss to the sector, and I do not believe Parliament has sufficient oversight to be satisfied that the loss of community-based organisations was justified. My wider point here is that I do not believe the current committee system provides sufficient scrutiny of the bodies that report to Parliament. There are two parts to this. Firstly, a report and oral evidence at one meeting are not sufficient to explore complex concerns. And I know members do have various concerns about the amount of time that... Yes, I will.
Elizabeth?
I entirely agree with what the member is saying. Is she also concerned about the fact that when it comes to some of our agencies who have to report to the Scottish Parliament, particularly in terms of commissioners, some are citing the fact that they are very seldom, if at all, in one case, brought before a committee?
Evelyn Tweed?
I would entirely agree with Liz Smith on that point. I think we have so many pressures on us as not only members, but also we need to get people in here so that we can scrutinise these bodies and commissioners appropriately. I absolutely agree. So we as members are often dealing with highly paid professional representatives of the very bodies that we are charged with scrutinising. And sometimes we need more time and we need more independent expert support. We do get a lot of support in Parliament, but sometimes on very niche issues, I think we need more. Secondly, there is a real danger that transitions between elections and changes in committee membership lead to important issues being forgotten or momentum in inquiries lost. At the present time, as I see it, there is currently no mechanism to pass on work in stronger terms than a recommendation in a legacy report. Even locating minutes, which I have tried to do from previous sessions, is really, really difficult. While it is necessary to allow flexibility, effective scrutiny of public bodies is too important to be lost or delayed during these changeovers. At present, the standing orders and the framework agreement between non-ministerial offices are not at all prescriptive. And I know there's good reasons for that. Flexibility is important. I would be interested, though, in exploring the introduction of good practice guidance or a similar mechanism. I also echo the concerns that were expressed by the Greens in terms of post-legislative scrutiny. I think they made some really good points here. They said that many laws are passed, targets are set, and then it's forgotten, resulting in a failure to assess their effectiveness. The same applies to newly formed public bodies and non-ministerial offices where there's limited follow-up, and that allows problems to go unchecked. To conclude, Presiding Officer, we are stewards for a brief time, but we must think longer term. Proper scrutiny protects our communities. We must develop an approach that is both robust and adaptable to ensure that organisations work in a transparent and effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Tweed. I call Davy Russell to be followed by Rona Mackay. Mr Russell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As the newest member of this Parliament, I think I'm uniquely qualified to share my limited, very limited experiences, as I've only ever been on one committee. And I've been nurtured to the highest level by its chair, Jackson. Right. But I welcome the work that has been done by the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. I recognise that one of the standout points from the report, which is the committee culture surpasses its structure, which is something that I can see from my own experience in the Citizens' Participation in Public Petitions Committee, where, of course, I cannot speak for all the members, but I can see and I feel strongly that when we're in the committee, we have a role to play in hearing and facilitating the public's voice, because that is paramount. And perhaps for the members who sit in other committees with a greater legislative scrutiny role, finding the balance between the party politics and the more objective work of the committee is harder to differentiate. and this is reflected in the report. But for the Petitions Committee, the culture is such that we basically leave our party hat at the door and we pick it back up on the way out. It's the system is first in this instance. I must acknowledge that the Petitions Committee is singled out in the report as particularly guilty of lacking gender balance, and of course I agree with the report where it calls to end single-sex committees, but sometimes it may not always be possible, but where practical I think that should happen. My main source of criticism for the committee system is it seems to be overburdened. Most of us are here till 10 o'clock. We sometimes, if there's a committee on, we're starting at 9. While the debate elements are required, oversight from the Chamber, there should be still cross-party scrutiny taking place in the committees, which would eliminate some of the minutiae. And from my perspective, we are still doing too much at stage 3 because the committees lack capacity. That sentiment goes doubly for post-legislative scrutiny, which we don't do enough of, and I so welcome the proposals to increase capacity of the committee system, such as the introduction of subcommittees may help in some instances. One that definitely would be with compulsory attendance when summoned by the committee for public officials and ministers. And the other thing you could also do is occasionally altering the chamber time to make way for committee business rather than the other way around, but that maybe be less practical. The committee system remains a strength of the Scottish Parliament, and I support the proposal to further strengthen the good work that's been done here.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I now call Rona Mackay, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a former member of the Standards Committee who was present during evidence taking for this inquiry, I'm really pleased to be able to contribute today. As I said in the previous debate, I believe committees are the engine rooms of this Parliament, whether they're taking evidence on important legislation or carrying out vitally important inquiries on subjects that affect the people of Scotland. So we've heard during this debate from previous speakers about the core questions of the inquiry and of the many responses from the many excellent witnesses called to help us carry it out. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues here.
Ms Mackay, sorry to interrupt, you haven't got your camera on. You would really be expected to have your camera on. Please put it on, thank you.
Apologies, it's a long time since I've done this. Apologies.
Ms Mackay, what I propose to do is I will come back to you. I'll take the next speaker now.
Thank you. I'm having some technical issues to get my...
and if you could maybe work with broadcasting to get your camera on, I'll call you when that's worked out. Thank you very much for your understanding. I now call Stephen Kerr.
Well, I begin with a simple observation that it is actually a pity that we have another of these Thursday afternoon debates on a subject that goes to the very heart of the effectiveness of our Parliament. And I'm very grateful to colleagues that are here. Of course, I would have hoped maybe we would have had a few more colleagues from all of our parties that would have come along to take an interest in how this Parliament works, because that is at the heart, I think, of the excellent report that's been put together by Martin Whitfield's committee. The bottom line of the report, I think, is it's a bit uncomfortable, is that the current committee system of the Parliament doesn't work to its optimum level. I think that's putting it diplomatically. Some of the committees produce excellent work, and some of the committees work really well. And it's actually down to what David Russell said, taking our party hats off at the door. Now, I genuinely believe that that's how Parliament should work. I genuinely believe that we go into that committee room and we should go in with a robust mindset, but we shouldn't necessarily, no, not at all actually, go in with a particular party agenda. Now, sometimes colleagues will accuse each other of that, and I think sometimes unfairly. It's possible to be robust and also be evidence-led.
John Mason.
I thank him for giving way. I mean, I agree with him to some extent, but would he not accept that there are certain fundamentals that our parties believe in, and we're not going to leave that at the door? I mean, for example, the Conservatives would like to reduce tax. Some of us would like to either raise or keep it the same. So we can't leave that at the door, can we? Stephen Kerr.
No, I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we bring our principles into the committee room with us. Of course we do. It's, I think Martin Whitfield talked about we know ourselves best, that's what we bring to the Parliament, something to that effect. I agree with him about that. But it's the way that we often divide very clearly along party lines when we should actually be led by the evidence. And there are some committees in this Parliament where, genuinely, the committees are led by the evidence. The Finance Committee is a very good one. I mean, Kenny Gibson, he's not here, but I would pay tribute to Kenny Gibson. I mean, sometimes we clash in the chamber. Some of that, you know, chamber activity is a different thing. But in the committee structure, and in terms of the reports that are being produced, that's a really good committee, very valuable committee, because because the rosettes are taken off at the door. Principles remain with us, of course they do. But when the facts change, we also have to be willing to be open-minded enough as parliamentarians to change our minds. That's the pragmatism that I think should go to the heart of all of our politics as Scots. Of course I will.
Ruth Maguire. I appreciate Stephen Kerr giving way, and I enjoyed working with him on the Education Committee. I wonder if, rather than meaning, you know, our party rosettes coming off, and as we say, our principles, it's talking about how you interact with folk on committee with different views, and that's actually what you're meaning. It's not about our party policies or our sort of fundamental political beliefs. It's about that negotiation and that valuing of other people's beliefs and views.
Stephen Kerr.
And if I may say so, Ruth Maguire was a brilliant colleague to have in a committee because she did exactly that when we were in committee. Ruth Maguire was often the way by which our committee did actually gel together. So individual members, irrespective of whether they're convener or not, conveners obviously play a very important role in creating that environment. But when there's members on board that are willing to listen to each other and move towards each other without compromising, and John Mason's right, I'm not expecting colleagues to compromise their basic political principles, but to be able to do that in a grown-up, mature way as parliamentarians. And our Parliament needs more parliamentarians. We need to take the view of what's best for our country, more than what's best for our parties. And my fundamental problem since I've arrived in the Scottish Parliament has been that this is a party-managed Parliament, and I find that, frankly, objectionable. I'll come back to that. George Adam.
George Adam.
Just listening to everything Mr Kerr saying, and we've had our disagreements, but we've always kept everything pretty kind of open and friendly when we've discussed things. But in my time here, I've never had a situation, regardless of political party, where a convener has been so objectable to me and so difficult until now, where on the Education Committee I have someone who I cannot work with, and it's extremely difficult and extremely partisan. Your colleague in front of you, Sue Webber, was excellent in her time beforehand, but our replacement became equally difficult. So it's back to the leadership example mentioned by the convener of Standards. That's the problem, is when you've got someone there, you need that leadership to actually be able to work with everyone.
Stephen Kerr.
I've worked a long time with the convener of the Education Committee, and I think when you get to know him, you can understand the way he works. And ultimately, it's down to his particular way of questioning that often things come to light that might not otherwise have come to light. I will give way in a second, because what is necessary for there to be effective committees, particularly with witnesses who are in the category, in excellent speech from Evelyn Tweed, it is important that there's a necessary constructive tension in the room. There has to be. And Douglas Ross, who we were referring to, is actually very good at that. So you have to see people in the round, I would say to George Adam, that there are aspects of all of us that other members might object to, but there are other parts of the same person that you quite admire. And that's true of how I feel about George Adam, for example. And that's how we gel as a committee. I will give way.
Yes, could I just say briefly, I appreciate the members being very generous with interventions, and what I would suggest is I'll give until 8 minutes 30 seconds. Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I've noted the point Mr Kerr made about convenership. It perhaps goes to his point about the need to seek election and to build a mandate across the Chamber and command the confidence of everyone. That would be a self-regulatory check on behaviour that might be overly partisan.
Stephen Kerr.
Well, I think Paul Sweeney knows that I very strongly believe in directly elected conveners. I think that's the one way that we get this Parliament back up in terms of the levels of its scrutiny. And I also think it's a good idea that those conveners make a commitment to stay in post. In the same way that I don't think the turnover of the committee memberships is any good at all, because you don't develop a feel for the subject matter. If you stay long enough, you actually begin to love the subject matter, even if you didn't really have much interest in it when you first ended up on the committee. But the whole way the committees are constructed, the nature of the role of the convener is so important. But ultimately, Alex Massey, last week in the Times, described something that happened in this chamber last Thursday. And I'm not going to name names, but I do think he's got a point. The nature of what we do in committee involves holding ministers to account. That's what we come here to do to a very large measure. And last week, Alex Massey's column in the Times, he described something he witnessed at FMQs, when basically the convener of a very powerful committee asked the First Minister, in effect, quoting Alex Massey, "Why are you so good?" Now, for some members that's fine, but I think conveners should have the self-respect to know that they have an official role to play in this Parliament. That means that occasionally they can't indulge in some of the stuff that might be quite enjoyable and even pantomime-like. And some people find that edifying, entertaining even. But for a convener, I think we have to expect different. And that's why we need to have the directly elected conveners. And I also believe that they should be paid.
The member is about to conclude.
I'd love to.
The member is about to conclude.
There are many things I'd like to say, but I hope that the Minister, I think he was waving my colleague James Bundy and I's essay, which has just been published in the University of Edinburgh Scottish Affairs, 10,000 wonderful words about what we feel we could do to make our Parliament what it should be, because Scotland needs a robust, strong, vibrant Parliament like never before.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call John Mason. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I wasn't sure if you were taking Rona Mackay again first. Well, many thanks for the opportunity to speak, and many thanks to the Standards Committee for their excellent report. And in the first place, I would say I very much agree with the first point in their overall conclusion, that it is essential that the Parliament has a strong and effective committee system, and I hope we're all committed to that. I'm also in agreement with the original decision to have one set of committees at Holyrood rather than the Westminster system of separate select and bill committees. I have had experience of that system as well, and I definitely think that's one issue where we are the better system. Over my 14 years at Holyrood, I have served on, if I remember correctly, finance, economy, rural affairs and transport. Let me finish this wonderful list. DPLR, COVID, equalities, social justice and education committees. Mr Kerr. Was it Mr Kerr?
Stephen Kerr.
There is, John Mason would acknowledge, as a former member of the Westminster Parliament, that there are limitations when it's all through one committee. And that is an issue of capacity. The stuff that Evelyn Tweed was talking about and the stuff that others have talked about, that can hardly get done, subject to inquiries and all the other things that committees are expected to do. If you're in some of the committees of this Parliament, you spend a lot of time on stage twos. And so the idea that we can just dismiss the idea that we should have bill committees, I think would be a mistake, and I'd ask him to consider that point of view.
John Mason.
Well, I have actually considered it. He'll be surprised to hear. But I think my main argument would be that, if you take something like the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I can't remember if Liz Smith was on the committee at that time, but we spent a huge amount of time. That was quite a technical issue on the Finance Committee, and then we dealt with the bill. And I have to say, I think that was better than having a committee come in cold. But I accept that there are different issues. Now, to look at some of the specifics in the report, first of all, the size of the committee. I do very much agree that smaller committees generally work better. Currently, I'm on one committee with 7 members and one with 10, and I think the one with 7 is better, although it does mean there's only 4 parties in it compared to 5. The culture of the committee, and the point is made that MSPs and their attitude is more important than the structure. However, structure does have its importance as well. The convener is important in setting the tone, However, I have seen that even one member joining a committee who is very tribal in their attitude can change the whole culture of that committee. So I agree that it is best if MSPs are not too party political at committee, but we cannot forget that we are elected for particular parties, even though I'm not currently in one, with all that entails. On meeting times, the Standards Committee rightly notes that Thursday mornings are particularly difficult, and I think it was Sue Webber mentioned that. I was going to intervene until she did mention it, having to finish at 11:40. By contrast, the two committees I've been on this week both ran till at least 1:30 on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I would suggest maybe on Thursday they could at least run till 12 o'clock. Members being on more than one committee, and I note the comments about the disadvantages of that, but I do think that there is advantages as well. I have experience being on 3 committees, which meant being every day of the week, which was very hard to prepare for, and that was a bit of a challenge. But I do think 2 should be manageable and can be advantageous. For example, the Finance Committee often feels that other committees leave everything financial to the Finance Committee. So having MSPs who are both on the Finance Committee and on another committee can help to bring a financial angle to that other committee's decision-making. On gender mix, we've spent a bit of time on that already, and I think the committee correctly makes the point that it's difficult to get gender-balanced committees if Parliament as a whole is not gender-balanced. And in one sense, this was, as I said, made more difficult, not, as I think Keith Brown has correctly pointed out, maybe in the current Parliament, but I think it was Nicola Sturgeon originated the idea of equal numbers of male and female ministers in government, and that did put pressure on the backbenches at that time. But clearly we need to focus, I think Mr Whitfield agreed, on getting Parliament sorted as a whole, and that will then benefit the committees. Can I mention something I don't think has been mentioned before, which is committee trips? I would question whether committees should be away on overseas trips while Parliament is sitting, and certainly not the whole of a committee. 3 or 4 from a committee should be enough for a trip, and it should be possible, I think, to make these happen during recess. However, I do very much favour committees having away days and fact-finding visits within Scotland. These can have the joint benefits of creating a more collegiate feel on the committee, and I know that many residents in Ireland and rural locations especially have appreciated a committee making the effort to visit instead of their always having to come to Edinburgh. Liz Smith.
I take his point about overseas visits, and I think we have to be very careful that we are accountable for taxpayers' money in that respect. Nonetheless, particularly if I can use the example of the Finance Committee, to which he's referred quite a lot, it is very helpful to see how other jurisdictions work when it comes to various aspects of financial management. And therefore, I think these visits can be seen as something that is very useful to the evidence of this Parliament and to ensure that we do work better.
John Mason.
Yes, and I'm not questioning the value of trips altogether, but we were left in the situation, I think it was when the committee was in Estonia, which I did not go to, when there was an issue came up in the chamber which the Finance Committee had to speak to. And fortunately, I was here and I was able to do that, although I'm not the convener or the deputy convener. So that's one of the challenges. I want to spend a bit of time on the role of conveners, and I'm not personally convinced that electing or paying conveners would really make much of a difference. What I do think is that chairing a committee, or any meeting for that matter, is a skill. And I'm afraid that I've been at countless community councils, council committees, parliament committees, church meetings, cross-party groups and other meetings which have been very poorly chaired. Probably most people could learn to chair or convene a meeting, but I have seen very mixed chairing in my 14 years here. And I would recommend training for conveners when they start. I take Jackson Carlo's point about we don't all want to be the same. But among some of the problems which I have seen include, 1, some chairs dominate and can take up to half the session of their own questions and comments. Of course, it's right that the convener should lead from the front, but there is a balance to be struck in allowing other members in. 2, not allocating time fairly between committee members, and that can mean that loud and pushy MSPs getting more time, while quieter members get less. 3, some chairs, on the other hand, are too laid back and let the committee just drift along. Managing time is an important part of convening any meeting, keeping both MSPs and witnesses within reasonable time limits. 4, getting the balance right between robust questioning but not bullying witnesses. In my opinion, witnesses are likely to be more open and open up more if they do not feel that they are being beaten into pulp. And in the long run, future witnesses are more likely to engage with Parliament if they know they will be treated with a degree of respect. However, I do accept that many of the public and the media enjoy it when they see witnesses being treated aggressively, and ideally they probably would like to see them bursting into tears. So we as committees and members of committees do need to decide if we are primarily at the committee playing to the gallery or if we really want to find solutions to problems. I guess there is a balance to be struck in there, but I do not think we're always
Mr Mason, on the important
right.
issue of timekeeping, to which you referred very recently, and exercising my skills as the chair of this meeting, could I give you one more minute and then...
I won't even need that. I've got 2 paragraphs. So overall, I'm a strong believer in our committee system, linked to a unicameral parliament system. Yes, there is certainly room for improvement. However, let's not be overly negative, as we sometimes tend to be. I commend the committee for its report, which I think is thorough, but I remain convinced that while the structure is important, the real key as to how well our committees operate is down to the behaviour and attitudes of the committee members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. In fact, we have not been able to secure the other speaker, Ms Mackay's camera to actually function for whatever reason, so I'm afraid we will have to, on this occasion, not call that speaker and move directly to closing speeches. And with that, I call on Paul Sweeney to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and congratulations to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in this fine report. And thank you to the convener, Mr Whitfield, for outlining its findings succinctly at the outset. I thought the summation of Donald Dewar's comments about cynicism and unrealistic expectation being the challenge we all have to overcome is the key thing as parliamentarians, and how we maintain public confidence in this institution after a quarter of a century. There are a lot of issues that we have to contend with, and we have an abundance of opportunity but a massive dearth of time in which to achieve it. And it's about rationing that effectively that will give the Parliament an ability to be effective, but also to manage the tension between, as Mr Leonard mentioned, consent and dissent in effective scrutiny of government and all other aspects of the public functions of this country. This is a real challenge for us to do it strategically and to put some of the more partisan instincts to one side in the interests of the country. And I think the point that Mr Kerr made about putting party before country has to come as a central part of the ethos of a parliamentarian. And certainly notwithstanding our ideological positions or our perspectives on how the country should function and how things should be done, nonetheless we should be in pursuit of a truthful outcome as much as possible. And often it's not about the politics, it can often just be about the bureaucracy. We have to remember that Scotland's had bureaucratic devolution for over a century. It's only been legislative devolution for a quarter of a century, and it's a question of how this young legislature can hold an old bureaucracy to account that's often very ingrained in its approach to things up in Carlton Hill. So I think we have to recognise that distinction as we perform our functions here as a legislature. And I think the role of the committees here in a unicameral legislature like the Scottish Parliament is essential to that. And I think there's been some excellent points made. And I'm pleased that the committee, though it didn't take a firm view on the role of elected conveners for committees, I think it has opened the door for this full Parliament to consider the prospect of it, and I think it's an essential one. Indeed, I made a written submission to the committee in its course of its inquiry in May last year, highlighting the reasons why I thought committee elections would be useful. Certainly there are some members here who have served in the House of Commons, and they will know at the start of the session it's a bit like a student union election where suddenly lots of flyers appear in people's offices with people canvassing election. And I think people were perturbed by seeing lots of Conservative leaflets appearing in Labour offices, for example, seeking election to a certain committee. And there was a sudden realisation, actually, well, the committee chair is allocated to a party, but actually all members have to come together to decide who the best parliamentarian is. And that was a quite learning curve for me, that you had to put the party affiliation to one side and look at the background of the individual, what they'd said in the Commons before, what their parliamentary record was like, what their campaigns were like, what their attitude was like, and working with colleagues and determining who maybe the least worst or certainly best option was available to elect to the role. But I think that's a useful thing to have. It's a useful check, and it tempers behaviour. It reduces that idea of party entrenchment and brings us closer together as a Parliament. I'm happy to give way to the Minister.
Minister.
I appreciate Paul Sweeney giving way. I'm just interested in his perspective on the election of the presiding officer. when he came to Parliament as a new MSP, and how he found that experience coming to a decision on the best candidate to select as a brand new MSP.
Paul Sweeney.
Yeah, I actually had the opportunity, because just before I left the House of Commons, we elected the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, and then came here and we elected the new chairs, the Presiding Officer and the Deputy Presiding Officers. And I think that was a really good moment, actually, because it saw the Parliament come together and think about who the best candidates might be. Obviously, there was some consideration of parliamentary arithmetic and who could best afford to lose someone to the chair at key moments. And sometimes in a very carefully balanced Parliament, like the Scottish Parliament, where sometimes the parliamentary arithmetic can be important, that does drive behaviour. But nonetheless, I thought more... Yes, happy to give way.
Martin Whitfield.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to Paul Sweeney to take the intervention. I wonder whether, having been in exactly the same situation, one of the reasons about voting for the Speaker before the general election was purportedly because those MPs voting for the Speaker knew more about them. Was it not one session trying to dictate to a future session what it should look like, where we have the benefit in this of each session electing its own presiding officer that can create the structure and, indeed, as we've talked about, the very environment that we want the Parliament to be?
Paul Sweeney.
Very interesting point, because obviously the convention in the House of Commons is that the Speaker isn't contested at elections, so they have the privilege of being able to carry over without much fuss to the next session, whereas here it tends to be that the presiding officer retires from the role at the end of the session. Yes, happy to give way.
Stephen Kerr.
Grateful to Paul Sweeney for giving way. But in the case of our Parliament, it would have been better, would it not, had the candidates for the office of presiding officer had to actually pitch themselves for the job, because we didn't actually hear anything from them before we got into the voting process.
Paul Sweeney.
That's a fair point, and reflecting back, that would have been a useful thing, because we were flying blind as new members. Rabbits in headlights. To have a hustings of some kind would have been a useful exercise to try and understand a bit more about the individuals involved in the process. It may have produced a different outcome, perhaps. But nonetheless, I think it's a really important point. I've certainly considered this in the round, and I've worked with colleagues, most notably Declan McLean, who's an academic at Cardiff University, on the constitutional reforms. I know Mr Kerr has worked with James Bundy, other people from outside the Parliament, on looking at opportunities for improvement. And I think they've all got really good ideas. But really, when looking at one academic reviewing changes to the UK Parliament's committee system, referred to an MP saying, elected chairs made all the difference. They're elected by the House, so they can't be too partisan or cliquey. So I think that's really important, that by directly electing conveners, parliamentarians can seek to build a reputation for themselves, enhancing the committee's status. And I think there's been lots of other points made. I thought Member for Stirling Evelyn Tweed made a really important point about it's not just about the government being held to account, but it's the agencies that are created by this Parliament that are held accountable by this Parliament. Too often there's perfunctory engagement, maybe one session without much scrutiny, and that's really something we need to look at in the case of the Scottish Housing Regulator. I have to give way.
Briefly, Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks to the member for giving me. Do you agree with me that a spotlight needs to be shined on the scrutiny of organisations like the Scottish Housing Regulator to make sure they are performing well and in a transparent way?
Always to the Chair, Paul Sweeney.
I thank Ms Tweed for that point, and I agree. I think there should be much more regular engagement with these very powerful bodies that are in control of potentially billions of pounds of public assets or community-owned assets, and understanding what's going on. That's at the essence of this Parliament. Engage with the community, and, for example, maybe having extra powers to call in decisions and to properly get to the, if there was a contentious takeover of a housing association, if that was of alarm to the committee, they would have the power to actually call that decision. And we know, for example, in the planning system, ministers have the power to call in contentious planning decisions by local authorities. Maybe the Parliament should exercise greater functions through its committee system in that role. Maybe it could be a good evolution of devolution to see what we could do as a Parliament to do more of that, rather than just leaving it to executives or the bureaucracy at Andrews House. Maybe we could do more of that here. And I also think there's great opportunity for interparliamentary committee work. I think we don't do enough of that in this country. When we've got 25 years of devolution, we've got devolved legislatures, we've got House of Commons committees. We could do a lot more together. Think, for example, with areas that straddle devolved and reserved competence, drugs, for example, housing issues, asylum and immigration. where we could have much closer working across committees and across parliaments to try and get more coherence to public policy and holding all governments to account where they actually have an interlocking role. I think that could all be really useful. So,
Mr Sweeney, could you
lots of great
bring your remarks
ideas.
across,
I've barely scratched the surface, but I hope I've made my point clear about my view on committee elections. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. I call on Edward Mountain to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I uncomfortably find myself in the same boat as Richard Leonard, but that I am going to give my views, which don't always necessarily tie in with the party's views. But I think it's important, in respect that I've been a convener in this committee for all but 1 year of my time in the Parliament. It's a role I've considered really important, and it's actually been more important to me than being a shadow position within an opposition party, because I think you can make a difference. And I've listened to the debate this afternoon, and there's a couple of things that I think we've missed, or we should consider. Is that I was incredibly lucky when I started being a convener in the Parliament that I had a very good senior clerk who enabled me to bounce ideas off them and fight over issues, over points, and it was all about being educated as a new convener on what you could do, what you couldn't do, and what was in the best interests of the committee. And those clerks, to me, are absolutely critical. And I think that when we look at committees, we should bear in mind that it's really important to ensure that the clerks are the right people to support the committee. The other thing I would just say is I've gone through, in my time as convener, quite a few business managers in my time, and actually getting a relationship with the business manager to allow the committee to work out what their programme is in the future is absolutely critical. And I think that that's something that committee conveners, I know nearly all of them do here, and I'm sure they do, but as a new convener, actually getting that relationship is particularly well. And I'm not going to embarrass the one business manager that I struggled with, because he never gave me a biscuit at every time that I came to his meeting. He's smiling, he knows who it is. On the issue of size, Presiding Officer, in the first committee I had a committee of 11, which for me was unwieldy and almost too difficult to manage. And to be honest, given the experience and the depth of knowledge and the length of time some members of that committee have been in the Parliament, it was virtually impossible. Sometimes you could benefit from the knowledge of Mr Lyle and Mr Stevenson. Sometimes you couldn't, but it does make it, when it's 11 people strong, a very difficult and unwieldy committee to manage. Yes, I will. Mr Mason, I will give way, Mr Mason, on the basis I hope you're going to remember when you were on the committee which I was on, which you ignored earlier.
John Mason.
No, I did say transport, and that was what I was meaning, and that was the point I was going to raise, because that committee, which I was a member of, had too wide a remit, would he agree? And we were dealing with all the rural stuff like crofting and all the transport stuff as well.
Edward Mountain.
And I will agree with Mr Mason on that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I found in this second session a committee of 7 people that actually is a very easy committee to get round. And for me, it's really important that it's not too big, because as a convener, I like to go and talk to committee members before committee meetings to find out their views and ascertain the direction that they're going to travel. It seems to make making decisions much easier. When it comes to party politics, I totally agree in some respects that you can't always leave party politics at the door. But I have clearly seen in my time as a convener when committees are whipped over decisions. I mean, on the transport bill, for example, I was told that members would vote in a certain way. It then became clear that wasn't the party way, and they changed their views. And I thought that was incredibly sad. I also found it quite sad at stages when there was evidence of questions being leaked to ministers prior to an evidence session. And certainly at one stage we had a private session on aquaculture, and I found I was door-stopped by a journalist in my office when I left the committee on something that had been said in that private session. So I think there's a difficulty there, and that's why I'm not keen for questions to be put forward, and I would always encourage committee members to make up their own minds. Yes, I will take an intervention.
Keith Brown.
Mr Brown.
Can I thank Edward Mountain for taking the intervention? And can I say that every time I hear this said, it is always a go at the governing party. It is always about partisan nature of government backbenchers. Would he agree that partisan party politics can apply to anybody? I know of a member, for example, an opposition member, who can't wait to scurry out after the meeting is concluded with a press release to go off to his favourite newspaper. It is on both sides, and it will only stop if both sides stop doing it.
Yeah. Edward Mountain.
And I agree with Mr Brown, and I can actually think for one committee member who used to leave a committee meeting early to ensure that they could get the press release out before anyone else. So I'm just making observations, Mr Brown. I'm not... Presiding officer, I should do it through you, not pointing the finger at anyone. I'm just saying my experience as convener. The other thing, I do think that getting more balance in the committee so that the governing party doesn't have the absolute majority in a committee is right, and there's very few committees in the Parliament where that is the case. The point that Mr Mason made, presiding officer, subject area, I totally agree with. The subject area of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee apparently includes things that I don't believe in net zero energy or transport, land reform being one of them, for example, and yet, strangely enough, peatland, well, I'm sure the member for parliamentary business would be delighted if I hadn't got so involved in that. But I think the point is that sometimes committees are given additional work which fall outside their areas, and certainly in the REC committee, trying to deal with ferries, trains, motorways and all the other things became virtually impossible. Have I got time to give way, Simon?
Absolutely. Paul Sweeney.
I never quite got on to the point about bill committees versus select committees in the UK Parliament, but maybe in some instances here there could be a good case for specialised bill committees where there is a particularly complex piece of legislation with a lot of facets that doesn't fit neatly into a silo.
Edward Mountain.
Presiding officer, I thank the intervention. I'm not used to having a bill committee, but I do know, for example, that the whole of the, or potentially the majority of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee consideration between now and the end of the Parliament will be on the climate change plan. And we do have other things that we have to do, including a members' bill and the other important things that fall within the transport portfolio. So I can see there may well be an argument for that. I did find in the first session, session 5 of the Parliament, there was a chance to be far more independent as a committee in relation to the work that we could undertake. And I remember working with the member who was then the convener of a committee, the member of parliamentary business, over an agriculture inquiry which was dealt with over 2 committees, presiding officer, and we had the ability to do that. In this session, and I just made the observation, I felt a bit, as a convener of the committee, a bit like a dog being thrown a ball and chasing it all around the place, whether it's land reform, whether it's a climate change plan. We have had so little time as a committee to be able to consider matters out with the legislation that's coming forward. 2 further points, presiding officer, if I may. On electing conveners, I absolutely believe electing conveners is the right way forward, and I hope that Parliament will give that consideration. I would have no problem standing up and trying to justify why I should be a convener. I don't think it's right. I mean, it might be that the convener of a committee should be of a party, but I don't think it's right for the party leader to decide that. And although I'm a beneficiary of that system, and I've enjoyed every moment, I think there would be right for change. And I also do believe that staying in post would be important. And there's nothing wrong, as I alluded to earlier, that as a parliamentarian, that you can't concentrate your career within the Parliament as an opposition party, as a leading member of a committee. And I think you should be applauded for that, because I think it's important. When it comes to paying, no, I don't want the extra money. I would have personally, as a convener, liked to see some additional staff to assist me, or staff budget to assist me in getting ready. I know we're ably assisted by the clerks, but sometimes reading all the papers and delving down into the fine things, having somebody to look over them and to flag them up would be extremely helpful. Yes, I'll give it to Mr.
Because that point has been made previously, that it would be helpful for a committee convener to have additional resource in terms of staff. And that again points to the continuity of a convener being there for the whole of a parliament, because if the committee convener is going to move during the course of a parliament, you're then left with the difficulty of how you would allocate that resource or reallocate that resource. And so that, I think, is one of the functions that might come out of having that commitment that you were there for the duration of the parliament once elected.
Edward Mountain.
And as always, Presiding Officer, Mr Carlow thinks through the issue and comes up with the same, or a justification for a decision that I think is the right one. Just one further point on witnesses, if I may, Presiding Officer. You know, I have seen in my time as convener, whether it's on as it was the REC Committee or the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, the same old people coming in and giving us almost the same old evidence. And I know the clerks struggle, and I applaud them at their efforts to find people. But I do think sometimes we need to take a wider field. And that's why when we're looking at witnesses, I do think it's really important that committees get out of this Parliament and go and visit areas, as we did on the REC Committee. We went to Mull and to various other places to actually hear from people on the ground. I will in just a minute. But on witnesses, I also think it's really important that witnesses make sure that the committee knows if they're getting money from any sources, that that's declared before they come into the committee.
That's exactly the point I was going to make, so I don't need to intervene.
Okay, and so, Presiding Officer, I'm going to wind up on that, but I would encourage when the next Parliament sits, I would agree that teaching conveners or people how to convene is probably not the way forward, but teaching them how to use the assets that they have at their disposal, and I particularly mean the clerks and all the other departments, is really, really important, because I think it makes them a more effective convener. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain, and I call on the Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Standards Committee's inquiry drew on a range of perspectives, including from conveners past and present. I hope in closing I can add to those perspectives without quite joining the ranks of Richard Leonard or Edward Mountain, valuable as I felt their contributions as well. The points I'm going to make are not from the perspective of the Scottish Government, which quite rightly takes a view that how the Parliament organises itself to carry out its scrutiny functions is a matter for it. Instead, these are some personal reflections from my 15 years in this Parliament, having served as a member, deputy convener, convener of Parliament and a convener of parliamentary committees, and of course having served 3 years in the role of Minister for Parliamentary Business, which coincided with the period of the pandemic, when the Parliament and its committees faced all sorts of never-before-encountered issues in scrutinising and passing legislation. I would contend rose to that challenge. I therefore hope these comments will be taken in the constructive manner intended. Presiding Officer, if I had to choose one takeaway from the pandemic period experience, it was the determination shown by committee members and conveners to function the best they could in some quite extraordinary circumstances to get through the work programme before them. And I want to give particular credit in that to Adam Tompkins and Lewis MacDonald, who led the Justice and Health and Sport Committees respectively, both from non-government parties, both individuals who placed their responsibilities as conveners ahead of party politicking when fulfilling the convening role. There was much toing and froing between myself as Minister and both of them, rescheduling deadlines or scheduling SSIs in a way that aided the committee in their efforts to complete their work programmes during those unprecedented times. And I recount that because I think it highlights the fact that being a convener, a truly effective convener, requires the individual concerned to rise above their party political instincts, whatever their political persuasion, to seek to bring a team ethos to the committee and recognise the leadership role. Presiding Officer, I made clear in my opening statement the Scottish Government does not have a position on the election of committee conveners, and I want to stress that point again before I move on to offer some further personal views. I've seen the evidence which the committee received that electing conveners might be seen as something which would give the job added standing. However, if the Parliament was to decide to go down that road, I disagree with Richard Leonard. The process of electing conveners should not be a popularity contest, nor should it be about when the convener is to be drawn from the ranks of the governing party or parties, picking the person viewed as most likely to be a thorn in the side of the government. Absolutely.
Paul Sweeney.
Does he agree that it really should be rooted in respect and having the authority on the subject, perhaps? You know, the Constitution Society has reviewed it in the UK Parliament and concluded that changes in the system have elevated the profile and status of select committees in Parliament and Government, and that is a big opportunity if we did it that way.
I'm going to come on to the point because I'm not sure it is about experience. I think because you can build the experience. I think it's about the skill set of the individual. I reflect with pride on the fact, if I could just make a little bit of progress, I'll come back to it. I reflect with pride on the fact that across my time as convener of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, I think we only required a division once. And we did some important work, which sometimes challenged the government. I don't think Rosanna Cunningham, the Environment Secretary at the time, reckoned she got an easy time from the committee. Indeed, she often told me the opposite was true in her own inimitable way. And the close working between my committee and the Rural Committee led by Edward Mountain to deliver a joint report into aquaculture placed me at odds with the then Rural Secretary. But that's as it should be. And I do think, to answer Stephen Kerr's question to me earlier on, that the right leadership of committees can foster an environment in which all members become better focused on doing the work of a member of the committee rather than a party member. Presiding Officer, I'll bring Ruth Maguire in. Yeah.
Ruth Maguire.
I appreciate the Minister giving way. I understand why he might balk at that sort of popularity contest expression. But would it not be right that actually the skills that would require you to convince your colleagues to vote for you and make you the most popular choice are actually the skills you require to be a good convener in terms of reaching out to people with different views, bringing folk together? I wonder if you would reflect on that.
Minister.
Well, that, of course, would require the members who were making the choice to consider that to be the optimal the thing in their decision-making process. I served a 3-year apprenticeship as a deputy convener. I know I would not have been as effective a convener as I immodestly think I was without that experience behind me. And I don't say that to suggest only seasoned MSPs ought to be in the frame to be conveners. People will enter here with suitable experience gained elsewhere in the skill set required. I saw that on my brief spell in the Education Committee under Sue Webber, who George Adam rightly commended for her approach to chairing. But I would suggest that from my own experience, and against this I'm not speaking on behalf of the government here, that if the Parliament is to elect as conveners, then the approach to be taken should be similar to that which underpins selecting a presiding officer, getting the best person for the job. And the qualities needed include fostering that right culture and atmosphere in the committee so that the outcomes of its work are evidence-based rather than partial. So there's a reference also in the report we're considering today to innovative working. And I do think the committees of the Parliament could build on some of the foundations established here over the past 25, 26 years. I noted a moment ago the joint inquiry carried out in the last Parliament by the Environment and Rural Committees into aquaculture, which with Edward Mountain leading on that. And that combined effort, I think, really did add to the status of the report. It was 2 committees of the Parliament coming together. I also think back to my time as Deputy Convener of the Raki Committee, when we conducted an inquiry into the way in which supermarkets treated Scotland's food producers. One leading supermarket indicated it would not attend. Under the leadership of Rob Gibson, we explored seeking to compel their attendance. That was something that had never been done by the Parliament at that point. That had unanimous cross-party support across the committee. In the end, we settled for advising the supermarket concerned they would be empty-chaired, something that again was a bit unusual for the parliamentary committees. They attended, and the session was much more productive in shining a light on the issue. And it is important that committees don't just see their role as scrutinising legislation and holding the government to account. There's so much more for them to do. So I hope the focus on committee effectiveness, which the inquiry has instigated, really does lead to the committees of the next Parliament kicking on. But for the conveners of those committees, elected or otherwise, to be able to oversee committees being at their best will require the assistance of an optimal induction process for new members. This Parliament has been a different one to the one I entered in 2011. Across the early years of that period, I not only found myself working constructively in committees with cross-party colleagues such as Alex Ferguson, Jim Hume, Claudia Beamish and John Scott. Friendships were forged, some of which survive to this day. This session has been a more combative, some might say toxic, setting than previously. And I know I'm not alone in thinking the inability of an extended, wide-ranging, cross-party induction process as a consequence of COVID laid some of the foundations for that. I'm aware the Parliament has plans to ensure the offering for new members will be far better, and I think that will surely help our committee conveners and this institution as they seek to ensure our committees become as effective as they have the potential to be. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I call on Ruth Maguire on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee to wind up the debate and to take us to 5 p.m. Ms Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking the clerks of the Standards Committee? Their expertise and diligence are absolutely key to the successful outputs of our committee. I think we heard from across the chamber that the role that the clerking committee play in all committees. The committee are grateful to members not only for their engagement in today's debate, but for that of our inquiry more widely. And it has been an interesting debate this afternoon. As we make clear in our inquiry report, the purpose of our work has been to ensure committees are well placed to operate effectively in the next parliamentary session and beyond. In this inquiry, we undertook a thorough examination of how committees work. We've looked at all aspects of committees' operations, including the structure of committees and the role of committee members themselves. We believe our recommendations to be practical and deliverable and focused on giving committees the necessary tools to fulfil their potential. There were a couple of recommendations that the convener didn't quite get to due to his very generous giving way to other members. If I can just take a minute to draw attention to them. One of those was bringing forward the deadline for when members' bills be introduced in a parliamentary session. Colleagues will be aware that we have a bit of a jam of private members' bills at the moment, and it's really important that the members' bills are all given the full hearing that they require. I will give way to John Mason.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I noticed that the committee did not make the same recommendation for government bills. Now, some government bills, like the budget, are time-bound, but should the government not also be bringing things forward earlier? Ruth
Maguire.
I think the committee would recognise that balance between the government's mandate and Parliament's role in making recommendations. I will give way here.
Jackson Carlo.
Is there not a slight worry, though, that by putting that block in place, it would favour returning members in a new Parliament who would be in a position to lodge bills because they had prepared for them in the previous Parliament, but that new members would then be disadvantaged in that they wouldn't really be prepared in time to lodge that bill within the timeframe?
Ruth Maguire.
I think, that's not something as a committee we discussed. I would reflect that I recognise that point. I suppose in a counter to that, having a well-prepped idea and developed notion of what you're going to legislate on is quite valuable as well. One of the other things committee recommended was giving committees more flexibility to meet in private when the chamber is sitting and to utilise Monday afternoons and Friday mornings for some committee business. Maybe most significantly in terms of structural changes, one of the proposals was that Bureau were able to propose time-limited committees. These committees could look at specific bills, specific inquiry issues, whether of a topical or cross-cutting nature, and post-legislative scrutiny. Our report also reflected on the suite of tools that are available to committees, committee reporters, subcommittees and joint committee meetings. We added hosting to this, under where one committee would be formally invited to participate in another committee's meetings, including access to private sessions and meeting papers. It's been really helpful today in today's debate to hear some of the positive examples of committee work and the factors that have contributed to those success. It's also been... I will give you.
Paul Sweeney.
I'd just like to put on record that my participation in the cross-committee work on drug deaths has been particularly rewarding. It's a synthesis of two different committees, criminal justice and health, and it's been really useful to get to the nub of that major emergency in Scotland, so maybe more of that could be a good thing.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank Paul Sweeney. I think that's a really helpful contribution and good to get on the record. Forgive me, I've got a lot of sheets of paper here. Yes, I think a lot of the contributions today were around culture and the importance of culture. In opening, the Minister recognised the workload of committees and that balance between the Government's mandate to take forward legislation and the freedom of Parliament and committees to approach the scrutiny function and, importantly, hold the Government to account. The report does acknowledge committees should have the ability to choose for themselves how they wish to go about their work, and it's about ensuring that there is flexibility and capacity in the system for all committees to develop their own approach. Jackson Carlo spoke to his concerns in relation to creating identikit conveners and identikit committee members. The committee's report discusses providing members with confidence and knowledge to forge their own path and carve out their own identity and role, and also acknowledges that different conveners have different interpretations of their role and different styles of working. Richard Leonard referenced the successes of the Public Audit Committee, and as we heard from others during our inquiry, it's sometimes easier for committees to operate more effectively when they're scrutinising organisations and public bodies and not government ministers. I think he would maybe agree with that. In terms of culture, we heard about the importance of conveners. Sue Webber reflected on her experience of convening a large committee and how that sometimes stifled the time that individual members had to make contributions, and the implications that that could have, where if someone's allowed to freely continue with their scrutiny, they might unearth some gem of information that will be helpful in the committee's work. Evelyn Tweed highlighted a really important issue that perhaps wasn't touched upon in depth in our report, in terms of the issue of holding bodies accountable to the Parliament accountable, and the challenge of having that one report or one meeting in a session to do that. On behalf of the convener and I, we would welcome further discussion on that topic, and what we can do about it is crucially important. We appreciated David Russell's contribution as a fairly new member to committee. Unfortunately, all I've written down was that, in quotation marks, you found Jackson Carlo's convenership nurturing. And that made me smile. As sweet as it sounds, I think it actually gets the nub of what a good convener can do in terms of helping people perform their best on committee and sharing their knowledge with them. Stephen Kerr spoke about the importance of cross-party working. I think that's shone throughout the debate. He also paid tribute to the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee are often held up as a good example of working. He specifically mentioned my Ayrshire colleague, Kenneth Gibson, so I should probably put his name on the record. And that importance of our role as parliamentarians, not just as politicians, and I think that's something that everyone would share. John Mason also provided a thoughtful contribution, sharing his 14 years of experience in service, and pointed out, in terms of culture, that even with an excellent convener, sometimes one member being perhaps hostile or tribal can throw things. He also spoke to the importance of fact-finding visits and away days. And I think perhaps particularly in this session, when new members weren't together for induction, those types of opportunities to gel as humans are important and contribute to good working. Where there have been differences of views on where issues lie and solutions to them might lie, it only adds further weight to ensuring there's a recognition of a common resolve that committees are equipped to fulfil their potential. I'm struck today by the support from across all the Chamber of the crucial function committees play in our democracy to hold the Scottish Government to account and to reflect the interests of the people that we serve. We need to ensure that committees are prepared to meet the expectations of voters and to be able to demonstrate what our committees can achieve. As the convener set out at the start of this debate, there's a collective will to improve the effectiveness of committees, and I think that's been evidenced with the contributions to this debate. Following today's debate, the committee will reflect on what we've heard and propose specific standing order rule changes which we'll bring to the Parliament for consideration. This will ensure that any changes can be made in advance of the start of the next parliamentary session. However, the standing orders are only one part of the answer to strengthening our committees' effectiveness. Ultimately, it will be for everyone in this place and the new colleagues who will join the Parliament next year to actively decide to make our committees work. It'll be up to them to embed a culture of interest, curiosity and, importantly, collaboration to make sure that it's a success. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Maguire. That concludes the debate on strengthening committees' effectiveness. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is decision time, and I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 of Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to now, and I invite the Minister for Parliamentary Business to move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And the question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And as I said, there's one question to be put as a result of today's business, and that question is that motion 19436, in the name of Martin Whitfield, on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, on strengthening committees' effectiveness be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. That concludes decision time, and we'll now move on to members' business in the name of Paul Sweeney.